control. Breach in 5, 4, 3.
What's up, guys? It's Uncle Freedom coming to you on another glorious and well-deserved day off. And today we're going to take a look at collecting data on your hand loads and what to do with that information, and more specifically, what some of it actually means. So if that sounds fun and interesting to you, maybe you're a new hand loader and you just need some more advice. Maybe you're a seasoned hand loader and you're just curious what I've got to say. Hopefully any of it helps. So guys, go ahead, like, subscribe, tell a friend. We're growing. It's awesome. I appreciate it. If you want to get in touch with me, at Uncle Freedom 213 on Instagram or Facebook, or Uncle Freedom 213 at outlook.com. Reach out to me there. I try to get back to everybody I get a message from on those platforms. That's the best way I can come up with to do it. Also on Facebook or Instagram, there is a Linktree account in the websites portion. Follow that and it'll take you to my Linktree account where I have links to all of the affiliates of my channel. People like Coltac, maker of the Note Keeper, Gun Mag Warehouse for all your magazine requirements and needs, Tyrant CNC for those parts for your pew-pews. Go over and check those guys out. There's many more on there and more to come. So collecting data for your hand loads. Why is that important? Well, simply put, and I said this in another video, if you do not like taking notes, precision loading for hand loading is not the right skill set for you. It's just not. So when we look at data, data will drive every single decision we make in the loading process to achieve the result we want. But first thing we have to do is we have to have a goal. That goal is entirely dependent on what it is that you want to do. I've done this a bunch of different ways, but if, let's say 5.56, your goal is to develop a load that is an absolute rocket out of like a 16 or an 18-inch barrel, but you can achieve closer velocities to that 28 to 2,900 feet per second in a 10.5 to 11.5 rifle, pistol, whatever. So let's just say that's your goal. Well, that's going to drive a lot of things. We know we're going to need a lighter bullet because we're never going to be able to push 65 grain projectile, that kind of a breakneck speed out of a shorter barrel. So we need a lighter bullet. But that also means that we're going to need things like a faster burning powder, like a 10X from Alliant, or a Benchmark from Hodgdon. We're going to need something that burns quicker and creates the pressure immediately behind the gun, behind the projectile, so that we get closer to a full burn in that 11.5 length barrel, and we don't shoot a giant flamethrower out of the end of the gun like we would if we shot a bunch of unburned powder out the end. So looking at those, like, that's already driving the decisions. We know where we need to look for powder. Now we have to find a way to make those components work with each other, and that's where your data comes in. Another one is, for me, Mark 262. Oh, I love that round. That is a 77 grain Sierra Match King, 2,750 feet per second, 18-inch barrel, sub-MOA accurate at 300 yards, standard deviation below 14. I put my own standard, which is I want a standard deviation below 10. That's a rock star round, in case you're wondering. But that's going to influence how I know I'm going to need a very temp stable powder. I know that I'm going to need something, because I'm shooting an 18-inch barrel. It can be a little slower, building that pressure a little bit more over time so that I get maximum efficiency in the way that goes without overpressuring my system by going too fast. So that's picking what we need to do, right? So that's going to influence the next decisions I make that are where I start. Now, once I've decided where I start, I've loaded up some rounds. Now you're going to go to the range and you're going to collect data. Lots of data. So let's just say we use something as simple as like this guy. This is the cheap Magneto Speed Sporter. It's not even the full version of it, but this thing is awesome for what they cost. They're amazing. You can't go wrong. That is going to give me, while I lay down to shoot groups at my made targets at 100 yards, it's going to give me my average velocity for the shots fired in that 5-shot group. I'm going to get a group on the piece of paper, which is going to tell me how well it shot out of my gun. I'm going to get my extreme spread, and I'm going to get my standard deviation. So let's break those down just a little bit, and we're going to look at what each one of them actually is and why they're important things for you to note. There's also some other stuff you have to know, and you need to take your handy dandy notebook, Blues Clues it up a little bit, and you need to know the temperature at which you're shooting that day. Barometric pressure and stuff can make a difference. It's not as big of a deal, but temperature is a big one. So have your temperature written down, your elevation and where you're shooting, because that's going to matter. That's going to affect where some of the speed nodes are and stuff. Write that stuff down. Have it handy. And then you need to keep track. On my made targets, I have the powder type I'm using, the bullet that's underneath it, and then I'm going to have across the top all my powder charges. But I'm also going to write down for whatever I'm doing, I'm going to write down the bullet, the ballistic coefficient of that bullet, just so I have it on record. I'm going to write down the powder I used, the powder charge that is in that group of fire. I'm going to write down what primer I had, my overall seating length, my cartridge overall length, and then I'm going to have my base to ogive length, which is a much more consistent measurement if you're shooting open tip match rounds, because the meat plat's a little different on all of them. And then I'm going to have the number of times I've loaded in that brass and the head stamp of that brass. That information is going to be in my book right next to me. Then I'm going to get my first big number we're looking at is velocity when I shoot the target. That velocity is telling me where I'm at, but velocity will also tell you something very important, and that is where you're at on the pressure curve. There are things that don't work in an AR, right? Like if I load a 77 grain Match King at magazine length, I am not going to see 2,900 feet per second unless I am touching some pressure areas I don't need to touch. And we don't all have access to a piezo chamber that can tell us what the actual pressure is. So that's our indicator. Like, man, I shouldn't be this fast. Especially if you're starting at a lower charge and the velocity is a lot higher than you expect, you may have a problem in how much powder you loaded, or your data, your where you started at is just too high. For example, I loaded Mark 262 using a powder not designed for AR. Oh, it is a very nice powder. And I was shooting, and in the middle of my group session, I hit 2880. And I immediately stopped because I know there's no free lunch in physics, and 2880 has got to be over pressure somewhere. And the time you figure out that the gun's not going to take it is when it blows up. There are other signs you can look at: condition of brass, flattening of primers, crating of primers, piercing of primers. Those are all things we can look at, but velocity is going to be a big indicator. So you've got your velocity. And then the velocity is going to break down into two other subcategories, and that is your extreme spread, which is the difference between your fastest round and your slowest round fired. Depending on what you're loading for, that number varies as to what you want to hit. If you're loading match ammo, you need to be as low as you can get it, because that's a consistency thing. But I will tell you that some things like this, I have my Razor Core. This is a 77 grain Match King out of here. It says match on the box. I went over this in my match grade, what does it mean video. Here's the deal. I've had 70, 75 feet per second extreme spreads out of this. That's not a match ammo. At 100 yards, it could be the difference in an eighth of an inch or a quarter of an inch in my group size. But if I back that out to 500 or 600 yards, which is where I'm developing the ammo to work, I could now have a 2 to 3 to 4 inch difference in my group, because I had one bullet going 75 feet per second faster than my slowest bullet grouping out. So extreme spread's a really good indicator. But your next one is standard deviation. And standard deviation is one that confuses people. I get it, because it's a mathematical formula. Standard deviation, very simply put, is how uniform your velocity is. So if you fired 5 rounds and you had an average velocity of 2750 with a standard deviation of 5, that means that the mean velocity shot to shot was no more than 5 foot per second higher or slower than your average velocity. That's where you get that number from. That's a consistency. And I've harped on this in match grade stuff. Consistency is everything when we shoot match and precision ammo. So when you look at your standard deviation, the smaller that number is, the more uniform and consistent your rounds are. That's a good thing. Usually it's a really good indication if you have a low extreme spread and a very, very small standard deviation, which most match ammo you can get 15 feet per second is considered match. As a hand loader, if we thought that was good enough, we wouldn't be hand loading. So as a hand loader, I shoot for single digit standard deviations, because that tells me I'm as consistent as humanly possible. The lower that number gets, the happier I get. So that's just kind of how it works. But lots of things can change your standard deviation. Not just powder charge. It could be your seating depth. It could be your primer that day. It could be the temperature outside. Those are all things that can affect your standard deviation. But generally, if you have a low extreme spread, a low standard deviation, and a good velocity where you expect it to be, you should be shooting a smaller group because you're not having a variance up and down. Another thing you learn when you test these things for velocity is you will notice as you load through the spectrum, you may have a load here and then 1.3 grains higher the next one, and your velocity only increases by like a foot per second. We know that as a velocity node. That means that that's an area that if you're dropping powder charges with a powder dropper, you can be inconsistent a little bit and still be consistent for velocity. But it also tells us that I can go back and chop down that window into like 10th grain, like 0.1 increments for powder, and really refine a load, because odds are there's one in there that shoots immaculately. And the last one is going to be your temperature. Temperature outside has a really drastic effect on ammunition. If you leave your ammo you're testing in the hot sun on the bench as you're working on the gun and you're working your way through targets or writing down numbers, when you load that into the gun, the fact that the powder is hotter than it was and the brass is hotter can actually increase your pressures artificially. Always a good idea to load with temp stable powders, especially for match grade applications, or to actually test your loads at like a lower temp and a higher temp, because what you don't want to do is develop a load that's really pushing the edge of the threshold at 40 degrees, go out and shoot a match at 100 and blow your gun up, because it can happen. So those are the things that we have to look at. Now let's break them down as to real practical knowledge on a made target. So M855, that is a 5-shot group. That is a 3.112 inch 5-shot group. That's not good, but that's what we like to call combat accuracy. Out to 300 yards, this is now a 9-inch group. That's smaller than my chest. Combat effective accuracy. But when we look at things like this BLC2 right here, 26.4 to 26.5, I gained 15 feet per second in velocity. My standard deviation is still single digits. But if you notice, this group is big and this group is small. This group is a 0.974 inch group. When I went back, I messed around with seating depth here and turned that into a 0.48 inch group. I couldn't do it with this one. Now we look at a really good representation. So here's 8208 XBR, 69 grain Sierra Match King, 2,765 feet per second, 6.65 standard deviation, 9.76 inch 5-shot group. Not a bad group. Not a bad group at all. I know most people will be happy about that. But in my testing, in my 1/10 of a grain increment bump up, because this was a velocity node for me, now we're looking at 2,810 feet per second. So we went up almost 50 feet per second from a 1/10 of a grain increase. I knew this was the bottom and this was going to be where it was supposed to move up. 4.9 feet per second standard deviation, and that is a 0.395 5-shot group. So that turned out to be the group, right? And the standard deviation was super low. So what I did with that information, that data that I collected, I knew that's somewhere I wanted to play with. So I came back home and I loaded 20 rounds of that charge weight. I also loaded 10 rounds, 0.1 grain higher, 1 grain higher again, and that 1 grain lower again. And I went out and I shot 10-shot group, 20-shot group, 10-shot group, 10-shot group. When you shoot these larger groups at 20 rounds and stuff, what you're actually getting is a couple of things from that. You are seeing what your natural cone of dispersion is for your barrel. That's a 0.39 inch group and it's beautiful. I will tell you that if I put 20 rounds of that load into a target again, I don't get a 0.39 inch group. I did get a 0.51 inch group. Still really good, right? Half-inch group out of an AR. But it gave me a larger data pool to draw from for my actual standard deviation. My actual standard deviation with 20 rounds fired was 5.2 feet per second. That's exceptional. And that load, I know everything about that load down to the BC on it. 0.301 ballistic coefficient. That's an actual loaded round of that load development right there. And I have banged steel at 1,200 yards with that load consistently without a problem. But all of that is possible because I took the time and I collected the most accurate data I could. Now I have exceptionally good velocity data. I have exceptionally good data for my ballistic coefficient because I know what my round's doing. I know how consistent I'm going to be on the highest of the highs and the lowest of the lows of my velocity. I took that data and then I input that with station pressure and elevation into a ballistic solver like Hornady 4DOF, and I was able to get extremely close with the ballistic calculations, and I was making minor adjustments to my real dope compared to the ballistics calculator out at range out to 1,200 yards. But that's because I collected my data and I took that data and I analyzed it and I used it to make a better informed decision that made me a better shooter with better ammunition. This is a huge rabbit hole. Stay tuned, guys, because we are going to go further down this in future videos where I talk about benchtop ballistics. Again, we're going to go over match ammo, tipped match kings, AMAX bullets, A-tip bullets, boat tail hollow points, flat base hollow point rounds. We're going to look at what makes a match bullet and how to utilize those in the best possible way. We're also going to bring out some actual ballistics gel testing for that video specifically. It's going to take me a minute to do this, but that video is going to have Mark 262 into gel, what this stuff actually does, and then some actual range footage and more targets with tiny ass little groups on it, provided I do my part that day. So guys, I am Uncle Freedom. Again, I thank you for your support. Like, subscribe, check out those link trees, reach out to me with any questions, and I'll be glad to help you. But until next time, take care of yourself, take care of each other. I'll see you later.